In this titled Tuesday game, Alireza Firouzja channels his inner Paul Morphy against international master David Cherv. By the way, the ratings I have there are their chess.com ratings, not their over-the-board ratings. Obviously, no one has ever been over 3,000 over the board. But Paul Morphy had two distinct qualities, right? He always knew how to get a big lead in development, and he always knew how to attack his opponent's king. And in this game, we see those distinctive qualities in Firouzja's game as well. He has white, David Cherv has black. Let us begin. E4, C5, knight F3, knight C6, and bishop to B5. Alireza plays the Rossolimo variation of the Sicilian. The basic idea is that he can take on C6 and cause some damage to black's pawn structure. Sometimes white does that, sometimes they don't. Black plays E6, and here bishop takes C6, BC6 is playable. White has done some structural damage, but black has a nice chunk of central pawns. Instead, Firouzja just goes ahead and castles here. Knight G to E7 to back up this knight on C6, and now rook to E1. Basically backing up the E4 pawn, which can maybe even advance to E5, and giving this bishop a place to hide on F1 where it can emerge later in the game. If he doesn't damage black's pawn structure, there's no point in taking that knight on C6. It's just not as valuable as the bishop is. B6, the intention of developing the bishop to B7. Firouzja plays knight to C3. And by the way, this is actually already a novelty in my database. Hard to believe. Firouzja loves early novelties. Bishop to B7, and we see so far it looks like the development is the same. White has 3 pieces developed, and black has 3 pieces developed. But that's not really true, because white also has this rook on E1 developed, and he is castled. A big difference in the development between the two sides. D4. Since he does have a lead in development, what does he do? He does what Paul Morphy would do. He opens up the position in the center with D4. CD4, knight D4, queen D4. Now the queen is centralized, and black would like to hit the queen with knight to C6, which he actually does. The problem is bishop takes knight. He takes the knight that was threatening the queen, and you could say, well, that bishop's moved twice. That's not good development. Yeah, but so did the knight. So he doesn't lose any tempos by taking that knight. Black chooses to take with the pawn. Perhaps later he can advance to c5. And of course, being down in development and having the bishop pair, international master Cherv would love to exchange queens here. But Firouzja says, I don't think so. David says, please. Firouzja says, no, it is not happening. And this queen on g5 is very strong because it hits this g7 pawn. And what that does, it makes it very hard for black to develop the bishop at f8. And here black can really begin to ask the question, what am I going to do with my king? How do I bring my king to safety? In order to castle short, he has to move that bishop at f8. But to castle long, he's got to move the queen. Also, there's a lot of air over here on the queen side. That's not as safe for the king over there. So he's in a pickle. H6 hits the queen. The queen just goes back to g4, keeping the pressure on the g7 pawn. Again, king in the middle. That's the key here. E5, perhaps bishop c8 can hit the queen. Maybe even queen to c8 in an attempt to exchange queens. Bishop to e3. Bishop c8 hits the queen goes back to g3, putting pressure on e5 and g7. And we see he maintains his lead in development. In fact, the bishops have now returned to their initial squares. The one on f8 never left it. The bishop on c8 went to b7 and now has come back. The rooks are still on their starting squares. The queen is on b8, which is worse than if it were still on d8. So white is in good shape here. Bishop to e6. Looks like black might be trying to castle long, clearing that back rank on the queen side. Rook a to d1, centralizing, controlling that key d file. And here, black plays the move g6, which turns out to be a critical error. The best move, believe it or not, was g5, which looks worse. It looks even more weakening. But there's a reason why g5 is better than g6, and we're going to see that right now. The move g6, again, it's another pawn move, though, when you're very behind in development. But what choice does he have? He has to develop the bishop. But then Firouzja plays this move, f4. And that, by the way, is why g5 was the better choice. It kept a clamp on g4. But when you have the lead in development, the king in the middle of the board, again, you want to open lines, just like he did earlier with d4. Now he does the same thing with f4, which can now be played. And he does play it, ef4, bishop takes f4, gains a tempo against the queen, queen to b7, and now bishop to e5, aiming at the rook at h8, and with the rook to g8, he'll never castle short. The rook at d1 keeps him from castling long because you cannot castle over check, as we know. So this king is stuck in the middle, and Firouzja must have been licking his chops during this game. The bishop goes to f6, further shrinking the territory for the king. If black were to lose control over d8, rook d8 would be checkmate. So a lot of pressure on the position. So he plays bishop to e7 to challenge that bishop on f6. That makes sense. And if Firouzja took on e7, queen retakes e5, he's still better. He's got the d6 square. The rook can go in. Also, the knight can go to e4. And so he's still clearly better. But the move he plays is even better than that and more precise. He plays the move e5. So now when black takes on f6, that pawn moves to f6, and it's quite strong, which is what happens. Bishop takes f6, ef6. And this pawn on f6 is extremely valuable, limiting the king's mobility. And then this e7 square is really sensitive for the black pieces. g5, too slow, one move too late. Should have played it earlier. It's a better way to put that. He would like to play rook to g6, rook takes f6, and remove that pressure. But now Firouzja plays queen to d6. And look at this position. The rook's just aiming down the board, the queen controlling any flight square for the king. If black were to lose control of e7, it would be queen to e7 mate. A beautiful position for white. Rook to c8 was played. Perhaps he could play queen to c7 to try to force the exchange of queens. But now Firouzja has a crushing blow. It's not the only winning move. His position is too good at this point, but it's definitely the prettiest. Can you see it? That's right. Rook takes e6, check. Forcing pawn takes. After queen takes e6 check, black resigns. The follow-up would be this. First, he has to play king to f8 because he has to defend the rook on g8. The rook on c8 is already defended by the queen. But after king to f8, he would follow up with rook to d7, supporting a queen mate on f7 and hitting the queen. The only way to stop mate is to give up the queen. And then after queen takes, we can see he's threatening mate on e7. Rook to e8 is really the only way to stop that. And then f7, forking the two rooks. Black would have one more spite check, but then after king to f2, the king is threatening the rook, the pawn is threatening the rook, and the material would be lost. A beautiful Morphy-like miniature from Alireza Firouzja. Hope you enjoyed the game.